Good to see you. Not to worry. Oh, that's great. Good, good. Well, I don't know if you'll know exactly what I'm doing from all this because I'm trying to give a sort of sweeping overview. But and how are you doing? What are you doing?
Remember when we last met? I was
Yeah.
Good to see you. Good to see you. Did you get the year off?
Oh, I don't have a card because, you know, I'm at the Wilson Center this year.
What are you doing with David Bornstein?
I'm going to quote it about social entrepreneurs.
And the show has supported you.
Oh, really? Great. Oh, welcome.
Are you in Marquette?
Well, actually, that's interesting. Because, I mean, one of the things I want to talk about is sort of the new social entrepreneurship in China. And, you know, particularly on the part of some of the NGOs that I am looking at and working with. That's the last part. Yeah. So good for you. So you're still...
You're always proud of
Yes, yeah.
And you were talking all about it. Well, then the rest of
Is there a timer now?
I don't know if I can do something differently.
But yeah, I knew Wu Qing from, you know, when she came, actually, she was at MIT for a year in the early 1980s, so I met her then. I haven't seen her as often as I would like to see her. In fact, I try to contact her sometimes when I'm in China, and I often don't get an answer. I would like to reconnect. And I saw her once briefly.
Maybe I'll tell him.
Well, do, yeah. I mean, I'd love to meet him. Actually, it's really interesting because his agent is my sort of former agent. So that was, there's another connection there too. Yeah, but I love his stuff.
Maybe it does.
Yes, he invited me to some event. So you're watching
Just for today and tomorrow, yeah.
Actually, I heard him, he came to SAIS, where I'm teaching now, and I heard him like for the first half hour of his presentation, and then I had to leave for something else, and that was it. So I did hear, yeah, I did.
I don't know if I've...
Yeah, but if he's ever here. And I'm at the Wilson Center right now.
At least I wanted to a couple of
I'm
times
lead
about
from
something
SAIS.
you've written about,
You can contact me too.
I don't write, but I am an avid consumer of literature.
Yes, yeah.
The world produces in my field since we have to act.
You should probably know if there is such a...
Well, I
mean, if you get all the
bios at the National Endowment for the Modern
least everything that
Oh, okay.
happens here.
Give some to me.
Yeah, I mean, sure, you must be on the list if you got some paper. Yeah.
We are worldwide research.
I'm writing a book sort of about problems of democratization in China.
So within China,
Which is sort of what I'm going to be talking about. Yeah. Well, just
we do fund,
if you know the Wilson Centers, yeah, a year. I mean, an academic year starting. I leave at the end of
now
May.
that's actually funded by the State Department.
Yeah.
So those are programs in the country, but we do
Yeah.
fund a lot of the internet
Okay, good to see you. Take care.
applications that are based outside the country. Actually, Anne knows all about it. Did you see that your footnote?
No.
Process footnoted in her paper. It just sent it to me. I'll have to forward it to you. It just wrote a chapter for some new book on fieldwork in China, and I'm halfway through it. And you're footnoted not for all your books, but for this report you wrote.
I'm glad somebody reads the reports.
I'm
Actually, didn't that make it into some ridiculous criticism of NED at one point? That was
yes, in the New Republic.
But I think that in that case, didn't they sort of think that I was reasonably balanced? I think
Yes,
I didn't come in
oh.
for quite the attack.
Reasonable is an adjective I've rarely heard about you.
Exactly. So I was very pleased.
Yes, no, and this is.
Anne has many distinctions, but one distinction you don't know about probably is she's the only scholar ever given 2 appointments to the Wilson Center for the same project.
That's right.
10 years apart.
Which just goes to show you that I have a hard time finishing things. No. Now do you want to explain?
No, let's
Well,
just
we
leave it
last
there.
saw each other. What was it
In Shanghai, in Xining, about
working on this project?
What is the connection?
favorite.
Well, I walk into this apartment of a connection, from Taz, and there's Anne sitting there. Of Sitting out there in cheer class when I we knew you were there. You didn't know we were there. That was it.
No, I didn't know you were there.
You
I knew
knew
that
some-
Melissa
some
was
of
there.
the- oh,
I
okay.
didn't know you were there.
Okay.
I knew Melissa was there.
Yeah, she made
One of
a
the nice things we can do is bring
Yeah,
people
so I
together
was
to
surprised.
otherwise.
Well, I think, did you come to speak at Harvard one time? Like 4 years ago or something?
It was a little longer. I'm not sure. And I'm off there later this week. It's,
Oh, really?
yeah. It's a grassroots resistance conference.
Is it this weekend?
Grassroots China, not grassroots US.
Yeah.
Great.
Because next week is in Taiwan is the grassroots governance reform.
Yes, I'm going to be there.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I was
Although
supposed to
I
go
don't
to that,
have
but
to do a
because of
paper.
this one,
Yeah,
I
I'm
did
only
say,
on the
no,
panel.
I don't want to go to that one.
Wow.
Okay, come back soon.
No, well, the rest of the first two. I was going to go to that conference, but it would have taken another week out of my teaching, and so, thank you. So
I
I
managed to
didn't.
do it and still make it back in time for the next iteration of this inter-ethnic communications, which is happening the next weekend at Trinity College.
Oh, wow.
Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians,
Quick reference
Hong
in
Kong,
the future.
Taiwanese, all together and talk.
Oh, really?
It's happening
Got a Chinese
November
name.
5th and 6th
My
at Trinity.
country.
Oh, gosh. And I'm going to be in Italy then.
Well, no wonder, right? You
wonder,
Taiwan,
right.
Italy,
The life of an academic,
Yeah, I know.
just splitting, getting on.
Well, oh, thanks very much. I had to take a trip to Taiwan. I've never been to Taiwan.
Oh, hi there.
Years of being consulting.
Let me present this properly to you.
Finally got it. So I had.
Chinese way or Japanese way. Okay, thank you very much.
Had a new
Thank
representative
you.
here.
Thank you very much. Here we go. There we are.
Trying to
For
get
you.
Leo Lee or.
No, Dave, no, CJ's placement.
Right, is Yahweh the other?
I think he will be in town the day after tomorrow for together with a delegation from China.
Oh,
From
really?
the
Here,
National People's
here.
Congress.
But he's
here.
not going to be at the Harvard conference, is he?
He is suggesting us to host a delegation from Minzhou, but nothing. Himself will not come.
More business than.
With another delegation to other places.
They really should make
That's
that.
such an important service for all of us in the field, by grabbing the most important documents, putting them on his website.
And even
That's,
if it's
this really is very useful stuff.
Oh, my gosh, I don't know what to do without
do,
it.
our lessons,
Give 1 minute.
project help.
Thurston. Oh, she's coming.
Dump everything.
Water, coffee.
Of course. I'm going to get off the stage and go and get him started. Yes.
Cell phone is
What time
off.
should I leave my house tomorrow and get it included?
I don't have a clue.
If you were leaving from your house.
Talk about it. I'll be here.
This air conditioner is a little bit too strong. Let's see, where's my piece here? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to the Wuzhou Western Center for today's seminar on China's third revolution, a gateway toward democracy, ? And let me first explain what does third revolution means. Revolution here doesn't mean violation, violence, and doesn't mean social transformation from bottom up. Rather, as some scholars used in the Chinese context, that mean completed reform from top down, rather than bottom up social transformation. As one influential scholar, he used to work in the Chinese news agency, and he used the term to refer to the democratic reform. And according to him, the third revolution means the 1949 revolution. The second means the reform and the openness initiated by Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s. So this third revolution means democratic reform. So that's the idea among some Chinese intellectuals, liberal intellectuals, but not official language yet. But this language does appear in Chinese official media, Xinhua news agencies, network, internet. So today we'll talk about the so-called China's third revolution. And we know that even though the Chinese Communist Party has ruled the country for more than half a decade, half a century, in fact, that the party is still concerned about its own ruling capability, so-called 执政能力. So that becomes a hot topic of the recently concluded that the fourth plenum of the party's central committee. So how to enhance the party's ruling capabilities. So that raises the question of how to rule the country in a different style or not. And we are not quite sure and quite clear whether this kind of slogans is stimulated by the sort of worrisome among the party leaders about uncontrollable corruption in China, so they want to enhance the party's leadership, or because they have a reflection on the collapse of the former Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries, socialist countries. So we invite a team of experts to explore these issues today in today's seminar. Let me first introduce our speakers, four speakers. And our first speaker will be Professor Suzanne Ogden from Northeastern University. Professor Ogden also served as associate in research at the Fairbanks Center for East Asian Research, Harvard University. She specialized in Chinese politics, democratization, and development, U.S.-China relations, and U.S. policy toward Asia. Her major publications include China's search for democracy, China's unresolved issues, and inklings of democracy in China, most significant. And Dr. Ogden holds a PhD from Brown University. Then our second speaker will be Professor N. Thurston. Professor Thurston is an associate professor at the China Studies program from the Johns Hopkins University. I'm proud to announce that she is also a fellow this year in our center. In fact, she was a fellow about 10 years ago in our center, so we welcome her back to our center. Professor Thurston specialized in contemporary Chinese politics and society, and her major publications include Enemies of the People, The Ordeal of China's Intellectuals During the Great Cultural Revolution, The Private Life of Chairman Mao, the work he did with Mao Zedong's private physician Li Zhishui many years ago, and also the book Modeling Toward Democracy, Political Change in Grassroots China. Dr. Thurston holds a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. Our third speaker next to me is Professor McCormick from Marquette University. He specialized in Chinese politics. His major publications include Political Reform in China, and China After Socialism, and What if China Doesn't Democratize? Professor McCormick holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. After the three speakers, I will invite Ms. Louisa Grave to serve as a discussion. And Ms. Grave is a senior program officer at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. She directs the endowment's grants programs for Asia. She was a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations from 1999 to the year 2004. And Ms. Grave has testified before several congressional committees on human rights in China and democracy promotion in Asia, and giving radio, television, and print media interviews on human rights issues and democratic development in China. And I would like to ask each of the three speakers to talk about 15 to 20 minutes, please no more than 20 minutes, and ask our discussion to talk about 10 minutes. Then we open the floor for discussion. And let me turn the microphone to Professor Ogden, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Today I'm actually going to be beginning with a rather broad paper about crystal ball gazing concerning the prospects for democracy in China. I just want to start out by saying that that much has been written about the prospects for democracy in China. And at the heart of this is a belief that China must democratize, and that democracy means much of what it means in this country and in the West broadly, liberal democracy. The three key elements analysts usually have in mind are a multi-party electoral system, freedom of speech, and a legal system that provides fair trials. But what most commentators really mean when they talk about democratization in China is the overthrow of the system of Chinese Communist Party rule. And the assumption is that China cannot democratize with the CCP, with the Chinese Communist Party in power. So I'm going to examine these assumptions and look at three scenarios for democratization in China. The first scenario basically says that China will resist further democratization. The second scenario, potentially the most frightening, is that the Communist Party regime may collapse abruptly because of unpredictable events or forces beyond its control, including demands for democracy within China, but that it may not result in democratization. And underlying this second scenario is the unpredictable crystal ball element. First, if or when a single factor or a background factor may set the stage for the sudden demise of Communist Party rule, and second, whether that demise will lead to democracy or to some other type of authoritarian rule. The third scenario, the most likely in the near term, I believe, is that the party state, with policies made on a rational cost-benefit, pragmatic basis, will continue to lay the groundwork for gradual, controlled democratization that is neither threatening to social order nor threatening to the party retaining power. This isn't to say that there won't be some steps backward from this trend, but generally I believe that it is the most likely scenario. Whether the party can retain power while reforms continue, I think, is a separate issue. So just then to look at these three scenarios. The first one, that the party state will resist further democratization. A lot of speculation on this revolves around the intra-party conflicts, and the fact that Jiang Zemin has stepped down doesn't mean necessarily that conservatives are now no longer resisting further democratization, because it can be resisted at many levels, including the center, but also at lower levels. Additional constraints on political reform could come from the broad spectrum of Chinese people, who are, despite the anger of many Chinese people at the failure of the state to take care of their needs, they are basically resistant to change. Authoritarian thought and the importance of interpersonal relationships to authoritarianism in China have been basic to its political culture for thousands of years. Indeed, these elements are so entrenched that some have argued the demise of Confucianism, more so even than communism, is essential for China's transformation into a rights-oriented democratic polity. But pushing for the demise of Confucianism in China has led to a confrontation with nativistic and nationalistic elements, and even to elements within the leadership itself who embrace a Chinese cultural identity and all the patriarchal and authoritarian impulses it encompasses. China is concerned that cultural openness can undermine community and that pluralism and too much individual freedom may erode law and order. Indeed, according to surveys by Tianjian Shi, although ordinary Chinese citizens broadly support the idea of democratization, they show little interest in real democratic reforms, such as multi-party elections to choose national leaders. And their willingness to participate in the political system, especially in the cities, has declined in recent years. This relative lack of public interest in further democratization, in spite of anger with pervasive corruption and growing economic inequality, can be attributed in part to the party's continuing ability to control and direct public debate, to general satisfaction with economic growth in the heavily populated eastern seaboard, and to a belief that greater democracy might endanger development. According to Shi's survey, 44% believe development is more important than democracy, with only some 22% saying democracy is more important than development. In other words, China's cultural conservatism is bolstered by a strong belief that there are costs associated with democratization and that its trade-offs are not necessarily worth the price. To wit, China's citizens have seen their rights widen significantly since reforms began in 1979, and they do not necessarily equate the problems they face on a day-to-day basis and the polarization of wealth or entrenched corruption with the central party's authoritarian rule. But China's political culture is slowly changing in response to international and socioeconomic courses, international forces. Are Chinese attitudes towards the value of democratization and development in China different from other countries that have already democratized? The opinion surveys carried out in 18 nations in Latin America by the UN Development Program indicate that China's conservative views towards democratization are widely shared in other democratic states. In the Latin American survey, 55% of those polled endorsed replacing, quote, a democratic government with an authoritarian one, and 58% agreed that leaders should go beyond the law if they have to. 56% felt that economic development was more important than maintaining democracy. Indeed, a majority would choose a dictator over an elected leader if that provided economic benefits. As this study of Latin America suggests, we cannot assume that a democratic government in China will necessarily have greater public support than an authoritarian one. And basically, it will probably have as much support as it provides benefits. The better it does in terms of development, regardless of what kind of government it is, the more likely it is to have higher public support. Scenario 2, the Communist Party regime may collapse abruptly because of unpredictable events or forces beyond its control, but it may not result in democratization. So a key question is today whether the party state can really stay ahead of the new challenges to its rule that have been set in motion by its very own reforms. Socioeconomic change in China is arguably already too fast. In this context, outside forces beyond its control, like, say, the price of oil or a war or another Asian financial crisis, or a specific event or condition in China, like the death of a leader or a newspaper report or an open letter, who knows what it could be. But as Mao said, a single spark can start a prairie fire. Although Communist Party rule seems secure for the time being, largely because of China's rapid development, it now has less control than before the reforms began because of a host of actions. Entrepreneurs who are out of control and acting illegally, the relentless degradation of the environment and depletion of natural resources, peasants angry with excessive taxation and the expropriation of their land, and rising criminal activity. The collapse of communist rule in Central Europe and the republics of the former USSR indicates there are plenty of other possibilities other than a collapse of Communist Party rule in China leading to democracy. It could lead to a breakdown of social order, even civil war. It could lead to a right-wing nationalistic leadership, or it could lead to a leadership made ineffectual by becoming beholden to special interest. Indeed, a multi-party system in China might be based on a mere division of the Chinese Communist Party into two or more political parties, reflecting the party's internal factions. So there's really no guarantee that just because the Communist Party is overthrown or collapses or is forced out, that democracy will follow. The third scenario is that the party state, with policies made on the basis of a very pragmatic cost-benefit calculation, will consciously lay the groundwork for advancing democratization in a gradual, controlled manner. This scenario builds on two factors. First, in spite of China's many problems, the Communist Party regime has fairly strong support from the broad masses of Chinese people, indeed even from China's intellectual community. Without it, the leadership would be far more concerned about making more reforms. And my argument here is basically that the Chinese leadership is much more likely to make reforms if it thinks that it has a strong support than if it thinks that that there's huge amount of opposition within China to what it's doing. The level of support for the Chinese leadership is quite strong. According to the study by Chen Jie, I see you have the book out here in the hallway, support for he did a study of urban support in Beijing for 3 years, a trend analysis, I think it was 92, 95, and 97. It indicated that general support for the regime never fell below 2/3 of the entire population. And this is in spite of the fact that on general policies, that there has not been a lot, there has been growing disenchantment with particular policies. But in the general sense of support for the regime, it's been very strong support. This is, of course, the urban element. And Chen Jie, in his study, indicates that the reason that there is strong support for the regime in spite of the problems they've had with, say, the polarization of wealth and corruption is a very nationalistic element in China, very patriotic element, and the other is a desire for stability. Similarly, Bernstein and Liu's study of the rural areas indicates likewise that in spite of the tremendous anger in the countryside about excessive taxation and expropriation of land, that actually in the countryside they don't associate these kinds of problems with the central leadership. They see the central leadership as on their side, and therefore Bernstein and Liu conclude that even in the countryside, in the poorest part of agricultural China, the anger of protest and demonstrations is oriented towards towards local leaders, towards those particular individuals who they feel are responsible at the local level for making their lives miserable, not at the central party's policies. And indeed, the central leadership has been quite clever about this in terms of giving the allowing greater venting of anger by people at the local level. Allowing them to write letters to the editors, allowing street demonstrations, or maybe they just couldn't control them. But in any event, that has been very important in maintaining continuing reform, the fact that, that there has been this underlying support for the regime. A second part of the reason for believing that they will continue with reforms is that they have already done a lot of reforms that are themselves generating further reforms. I hate to use the word inexorable or necessarily will reform, because we all know that things can turn on a dime and overnight a world can change. But there is, I would say, a bit of a snowball effect in China that one reform is building on the other. And my book, Inklings of Democracy in China, is about those, a lot of those changes that have been made, both not just in the economic arena, but also in the political and legal arenas. And third, I think in the reform period, China has, that's since 1979, so the last 25 years, China has become a far more pluralistic society. Even if you don't want to call it more democratic, it's far more pluralistic than it used to be. There is just a huge array of interest groups, of associations, of different kinds of competing interest in China that simply have to express their views for China to keep on moving forward, and are expressing their views. And there is an expanding tolerance for different values and ideas and beliefs throughout China. Although, of course, there are still problems with the control of the media and occasional crackdowns on it, it's nothing like it was in the past. The party just can't go out and throw these people out in labor camps the way they used to and shut down the whole society. It's just not possible. The worst that happens these days is usually that people are reprimanded or censored or demoted or have their program taken off the airways. But it's nothing like it was before the reforms began. And in this respect, finally, I would say the most recent meeting, the fourth plenum of the 16th Party Congress, has also made what appears to be a major step forward in at least introducing the idea of reforming the party itself, the emphasis on inter-party democracy, the importance of the party obeying the law, and so on. In short, to argue that China has few prospects for democratization must assume that something would have to stop a process that is turning China into a more transparent, more pluralistic, and more rights-based society. And the party state itself has done a lot of this. I won't go in here, maybe in the question session, about some of the bad things that have happened and the good things in terms of the media. Obviously, the media are expanding exponentially in China, in part because of commercialization and in part because of the expansion of the web, the internet, and all other kinds of technologies. It is true that there have been some recent cases of books being censored, but what's interesting to me, and also individuals, what's interesting to me is that often the censorship comes after they've published a couple million copies and have them in print, and then they're censored, and the government bookstores withdraw these things from publication, but the pirated editions continue, like the recent survey of Chinese peasants that was produced by Chen Guidi and Wu Chuntao, which became a bestseller in China, and only then was it taken off the market. Also, there have been many statements made by senior leaders. They're often retired leaders, but they get to have their stuff in print before they're censored for it. Or if they're censored at all, for example, before the fourth plenum of the 16th Party Congress in September of this year, several of them called for Jiang Zemin to step down. That was pretty daring, but of course, if you're 80 years old, you don't really care too much about the consequences. But there have been a lot of provocative statements that have been made in China, a lot of daring do, especially by a very aggressive press. Many people who read the press both in Hong Kong and the mainland feel that the mainland press is much more interesting than the Hong Kong press. But there's been an awful lot done, for example, in a world I've gotten very interested in, which is the world of dams and water and irrigation and stakeholder involvement, management of the rivers in China, to the point where the government has responded with a requirement now that all stakeholders be involved. Not that it's actually happening very well, but it's on the books as something that has to be done. There's a story recently of some kid who was let into, a young person let into a university based on the national exam, and then his father was called by a school official saying he have to pay $12,000 for her to get that seat. He took it to the newspapers, became a news story that was picked up by the China Daily News, or who was it? One of the newspapers, maybe Beijing Youth, published a whole series about corruption in the universities and has brought about dramatic efforts to reform. That's all very recent, but it really caused a hullabaloo. Okay, well, my time is up. Just to conclude, if I could just say one thing in conclusion, I think that there are basically some very interesting paradoxes in China. One is that the Chinese reject Western pressures and standards for governance, and yet they take our standards quite seriously and are discussing reforms that would liberalize China's political systems. They study the European system very carefully. They talk to their legislators. They go there and observe their system. And the second paradox, to conclude, is that many of the democratizing steps introduced since the reform period began in 1979 may actually have enhanced the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to remain in power. So those are the two paradoxes that seem to be helping the Communist Party hang in there even as they reform. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gang. Actually, I would like to start by wishing Gangling a happy birthday. But I won't. Yeah, but right. But I won't say how, because I don't know how old you are. You look very young to me.
He wants to look older, though.
Oh, I suppose. When I was wondering what I might say here today, and in particular whether I should focus on the big picture as I see it in China or the specifics of some of the research and writing that I'm doing now, Bob Hathaway, who's the head of the Asia program here and who's sitting in the back, suggested that I should try to focus on the big picture. So I will try to do that. But I have to do it from the perspective from which I do research. Gangling mentioned that this is my second time at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I was last here 13 years ago, as a matter of fact. And I remember then that when I introduced myself to my fellows here, which we all have to do when we arrive, I described myself as a sort of China counterpart to the narrator in one of Iris Murdoch's novels, The Philosopher's Pupil, who says, "My role in life is listening to people's stories." I thought 13 years ago and still think today that my role in life is to listen to Chinese people tell their stories to me, and then to try to tell those stories here in the United States in a way that makes sense both to the people who told me the stories and to us here in the United States, which is to say that I'm not talking about this third revolution from the top. I really work at the very, very grassroots level in China. I love nothing more than listening to ordinary Chinese people tell their stories. And what I want to do today is to begin by reporting to you some of what I have been hearing in the 13 years since I was last a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Throughout the 1990s, as I traveled through China, and I should say there's nothing social scientific about what I do, but I have been to all but 2 of China's provinces during that time. The thing that I heard most frequently in traveling throughout China in the 1990s, when I would ask people how things are going, is that things were, the Chinese would say, Taiwan, too chaotic. They thought that this process of socio-economic reform was just going too quickly. It was very confusing to them, and they saw chaos around them. I have to say that the Chinese government, if you read the Chinese press, you will see repeatedly references to chaos, to instability. You will see repeatedly references as to why we do or don't do something. based on references to whether doing or not doing something will make China stable or unstable. And this applies to democracy as well. And I would like to quote to you from Jiang Zemin in 2001 when he talks about democracy and instability. He says, should China apply the parliamentary democracy of the Western world, the only result will be that 1.2 billion Chinese people will not have enough food to eat. The result will be great chaos, and should that happen, it would not be conducive to world peace and stability. But, you know, when I talk to, again, ordinary Chinese people and try to get a sense of what they're worried about when they talk about chaos, I've tried to sort of categorize their worries and categorize what for them are the sources of potential chaos in China. And again, overwhelmingly, what I hear is 人口太多, meaning there are too many people. And yeah, when I give a sort of 3-hour version of what I'm saying here today, and when I do give my 3-hour version, I spend a lot of time talking about the implications for China of having 1.3 billion people. And I won't belabor the point today, but and you know, it seems very trite to remind everybody of how many people China has and how big it is. But the fact of the matter is that 1.3, thinking about how to govern and how to maintain stability in a population of 1.3 billion people is really pretty overwhelming. And just to give you sort of some ways of trying to think about this, we all know that China has 23% of the world's population, 7% of the world's arable land. If we in the United States had the same ratio of population to arable land, our population would be more than 2 billion right now, which is to say 7.5 times larger than it is right now. So imagine trying to govern the United States with 7.5 times more people than we have right now. So I mean, I wonder even in the best of times how governable a population of 1.3 billion is. But there are other issues, I think, that China also faces today that the Chinese people worry about in terms of stability that are also related to demography. Not only is China a big country in terms of population, but that population is also very much on the move. You see many different statistics these days about how many people are moving from the rural areas into the urban areas and to the coastal regions along Fujian and Guangdong, but the figures are anywhere from 120, 140, 180, and I've even recently seen figures from the Chinese press of over 200 million people on the move from the countryside to the city and to the coastal areas. When this mass movement began, the Chinese government talked about the potential for chaos of letting these people leave the land sort of willy-nilly. In recent years, recent months, in fact, the Chinese government is sort of it has sort of accepted the fact that this mass migration is going on and in fact is talking about the benefits of urbanization. But it's also true that when you think about China's own projections of how quickly urban areas will be growing in the next 16 years, they're really pretty scary, and you wonder how China is going to do this and maintain stability. And here, let me just give you these figures. In 1978, only 20% of the Chinese population, or then 190 million people, lived in China's cities. Today, 2004, 30% of the population, or 390 million people, live in China's cities. But the Chinese project that by 2020, 16 years from now, when the total population is projected to be at 1.4 billion people and still growing, that 60% of the Chinese population, which would be 860 million people, are expected to live in Chinese cities, which is to say that between now and the year 2020, China's urban population is expected to grow by about 2 times the current size of the U.S. population. And again, when you think of how China is going to handle this rapid urbanization in cities that already have major problems, then one wonders also about the question of stability. Again, related to demographics, another thing to sort of think about with respect to China is that the rate of unemployment right now is very, very high and has the potential to grow. Again, there are lots of very different statistics about both how many people are unemployed in China and what the rate of unemployment in China is. But in recent years, the recent figures suggest that some 45 million people in China's cities have been laid off from the state-owned enterprises, and that in the countryside, somewhere between 150, 170, or 200 million people are essentially surplus labor. I've read a report from the Wilson Center since I came here that suggested that the real rate of unemployment in China right now is 25%. That's an awfully lot of people, and again, that's one of the reasons that both ordinary Chinese people and the Chinese government are worried about the potential for instability during this process of socioeconomic change. Other potential sources of instability that both Chinese people and the government and scholars talk about is the growing inequality in China. In 1978, when the Chinese began their reforms, China was a relatively egalitarian society. Now, not only is China's rate of growth growing faster than any other country in the world, but so is its rate of inequality. That's not to say that it has the highest rate of inequality, highest level of inequality by any means. It's simply that the rate of inequality is growing faster than in any other country in the world. So you're beginning to see very significant gaps between urban and rural areas and between coastal and inland areas. And this, again, a cause for concern. And then, of course, finally, I think most Chinese perceive that the level of corruption in their society has very, very dramatically increased during this reform period. And if you remember back to 1989, one of the major reasons for the protests during 1989, during the spring of 1989, was the perception of widespread corruption on the part of Chinese officials. That perception, I think, is even stronger today. Although the question is whether people are just sort of getting used to the corruption and thinking that there's been a sort of equalization of corruption, equal opportunity to corruption in China, or whether it's a cause of anger and potential instability. The fact is that China recognizes all these problems. They are seeking in many different ways to address these problems. China's scholars speak very, very openly about these problems. I spent a month this summer taking a Fulbright group through China, meeting with lots of Chinese scholars. And I teach a course at SAIS on major issues facing China in the 21st century. And I have to say that my issues and the issues that Chinese scholars were addressing were exactly the same issues. We all agree that these are problems. But I mean, the reason I'm talking about all these problems and trying to report what I'm hearing at the grassroots level in China is that, I think that the question of governance in China is simply a very, very basic question. How does a country govern itself with so many people and with such great socioeconomic change going on? I can't help, of course, but think of Samuel Huntington in Political Order in Changing Societies, who clearly sees a relationship between political instability and socioeconomic change. So there's good reason, I think, to be concerned about issues of stability and instability in China today. But there's a second question related to the issue today, and that is, could some of these problems that China faces today be better dealt with through the introduction of democratic reforms? And that's one of the issues that I want to address while I'm here at the Wilson Center. I don't have the answer to that question yet, or to those questions yet, but my hunch is that in fact further political reform could in fact lead to greater stability rather than greater instability over time. The most obvious area where this would be true is in the area of this widespread corruption that you see in China right now. If you actually had the opportunity to vote the bad guys out of office, then corruption as a problem of instability might disappear. Similarly, if you think about the inequality between coastal regions and the interior of China, if there were greater representation of the interior provinces in Beijing, then presumably there would be more ways for the central government to begin directly addressing some of the problems of inequality. One has to believe that if labor unions were actually introduced into China and were considered legitimate and labor unions were allowed actually to negotiate, that the problem of unrest among workers might be pretty well addressed. I think the problem is that what a lot of people can't see in China, when I have to say that when I travel through China, the sentiment in favor of democracy is stronger now than it was when I was in China in 1989. The question is not, do we want it or not? The question is, how do we get from here to there? And I think the fear is that there would be significant instability in the process of getting from A to B, and that's what people are worried about. But I do want to say something about, from on the ground, about some things that are happening in local areas down on the ground that are sort of paving the way for, in the long term, a democratic transition. We hear a lot about the crisis of values in China today, and I think that that's true. We hear also, of course, about the rise of nationalism that Suzanne Ogden mentioned. We hear about religious persecution. But one of the things that's very striking to me, I've been going to China since 1978, is a very, very significant increase in the practice of religious belief, both in the cities and in the countryside. And I say that because what's important to me, it's a very, very complicated issue. There are young people, for instance, who have recently decided to become Christian, and you ask them why, and they'll say, well, the West is rich, the West is Christian, therefore if I become Christian, maybe I'll get rich. And there are a lot of, in the underground churches, there's a lot of sort of cult activity. There's some very, very bizarre religious sects in China. What's important to me about the rise of religious belief, though, is the fact that the state clearly no longer has a monopoly over how people think, that people are looking for a new and different set of values to guide their lives and to give meaning to their lives. And I think that that's very, very important. The second thing that I see as being very important, and I've written about it, Suzanne has too, is that village elections are now mandated by law all over China. The village leader and the village committee have to be elected by the people. The candidates have to be chosen by the people, and there have to be more than one candidate for the position. I wish this had gone a lot further. There are 650,000 villages in China, and it's very, very difficult to say how successfully these elections have been implemented in all 650,000 villages. But it is a way, I think, of laying the groundwork for a later introduction of democracy. It's, first of all, it's providing people with the technique of carrying out election. And as we know from our own country, getting the technique right, getting literally how do you have a fair election is very, very difficult. And it's giving people a sense of choice in places where before there was no sense of choice. But the third and last thing that I want to mention, which I think is very, very important and still has been very little studied here in the United States, is the very, very dramatic rise in the number of non-governmental organizations in China, or GONGOs, government-organized non-governmental organizations in China. A figure that I heard several months ago was that there are now 120,000 non-governmental organizations officially registered in China at the national level with the Ministry of Civil Affairs, and that throughout China there are 1.8 million NGOs that are not officially registered. I have spent as much time as I possibly can in the past couple of years looking at a number of these non-governmental organizations, and that's what I'm writing about right now. I'll say at the outset that to me, the most impressive thing about the non-governmental organizations that I'm in contact with is the nature of their leadership. A couple of you noticed as I came in carrying this book by David Bornstein called How to Change the World, Social Entrepreneurs and the Power of New Ideas. The leaders of all of the NGOs that I've been meeting with and trying to do research on in the past couple of years are what Bornstein would describe as social entrepreneurs. And Bornstein defines social entrepreneurs as people with new ideas to address major problems who are relentless in the pursuit of their visions, people who simply will not take no for an answer, who will not give up until they've spread their ideas as far as they possibly can. Social entrepreneurs are transformative forces. And certainly, as I say, the leaders of the NGOs that I've been working with in China are, by every sense of the definition, social entrepreneurs. They have a mission to which they are wholeheartedly devoted. Each of them has been a transformative force, and that organization has been a transformative force in the areas where they work. They've all made huge personal sacrifices in order to do what they're doing. And again, they really have profoundly changed the lives of the people they serve. And I think it's certainly a credit to the Chinese government that these social entrepreneurs are allowed to function and to thrive. This is something that I think you certainly didn't see under Mao, and I think you really mostly didn't see it during the 1980s. It's a phenomenon largely of the 1990s. And again, I think it's not a trivial phenomenon. As I say, I am studying very, very closely only 3 of this 1.8 million NGOs in China. But I'm assuming that if we do have an opportunity to go and study some of these other NGOs, that you'll find an awfully lot of these people are social entrepreneurs, that they are bringing change to their local areas. But of course, one of the reasons that China scholars and scholars in general study NGOs is the assumption that NGO development also contributes to the development of civil society. And in fact, many people in the China, I don't know many people, but some people in the China field simply refer to these organizations as civil society organizations. I think that at least as I understand civil society, is a much more complicated issue. Some of the, for instance, one of the organizations that I'm looking at is probably China's most famous GONGO, government-organized, non-government organization, Project Hope, which was started by Xu Yunguang, who is decidedly a social entrepreneur, whose goal is to provide education to poor children in rural areas who would not otherwise get an organization. His organization is probably the most successful of any Chinese NGO or GONGO. Something like 2.5 billion children have received an education they wouldn't otherwise have gotten. He's built something like 8,000 schools throughout China. But in terms of his contribution to civil society in China, no, not at all. It seems to be his organization internally is organized very hierarchically. He's the boss. There's very little sort of give and take within the organization. There's very little consultation between him and the communities that he solves. Communities to whom he provides projects. On the other hand, I've been spending a lot of time lately in Qinghai province, which is China's second poorest province, working with some local NGOs there. And while their scope is much, much more narrow than the scope of Project Hope, these organizations, it seems to me, really, really are organized as civil society organizations and are having an impact on civil society. Internally, while the leaders are indeed social entrepreneurs, they are not organized hierarchically. They are organized as associations where major decisions are made by the entire association, where the staff have regular staff meetings and discuss and decide what they're going to do for the coming month, what their projects will be, and where increasingly when they go out into rural areas, and many of these are poverty alleviation projects, they follow what they call participatory rural assessment. They go out into villages, they gather the villagers together, they get the villagers to talk about what their assets are, what's good about where they live, what their problems are, and then try to come together and find solutions to those problems, and then get international funding. I have to say that one of the reasons I think they are successful is because some of these local NGOs are in fact being mentored by international organizations. But and this, I guess, if there's any policy relevance to what I want to say, first of all, I think we need to know a lot more about what's happening with these NGOs in China, because my suspicion is that there are a lot of other people like the ones I know doing really good things. And secondly, it seems to me if we want to work closely at the grassroots level to sort of foster the type of civic society that would bring democracy to China, we need to be very, very attentive to these organizations and work with them. Thank you.
Well, I too would like to thank the Wilson Center for inviting me, and Gang Lin in particular, and also well, I too would like to thank the Wilson Center for inviting me here today to be with these other very distinguished people, and particularly Gang Lin for issuing the invitation, and also Wilson Lee, who did a lot of arrangement work to make this possible. My particular take on this third revolution that Gang Lin talked about is what's been happening in the Chinese media. And I am deeply ambivalent about what's happening in the Chinese media, and will try to explain to you the basis of my ambivalence. The place I'd like to start today is with a couple of stories. I too am a tremendous fan of stories. And these two stories that I will give you the bare bones of are an example of media sensations in the last 4 or 5 years in the Chinese media. And there's been a whole string of these, and they raise some very interesting issues, both in terms of the content of the stories and to try and think about the structural changes that make it possible to have media sensations in China, particularly media sensations that escape, at least briefly, the control of the censors, and also to ask some questions about what this all means for governance and democratization. Well, let me start with a couple of examples of the stories. The first one comes from June of 2003, and the events took place in Chengdu. There was a young mother in Chengdu by the name of Li Guifan, and she had been unemployed for several years. I believe she had been laid off a state enterprise. And over the course of her unemployment, she had not received much in the way of public assistance. She was dependent on handouts from her father and older sister to survive. She had had a child out of wedlock, who at the time of our story was 3 years old, and the story is generally known by the child's name, Li Si. And she had also become addicted to drugs. I'm not sure exactly what sort of drugs. And Li Guifan set off to burgle a grocery store some 10 kilometers from her flat where she lived with her 3-year-old daughter, and left her daughter locked in her flat. The burglary went badly. She was apprehended and was taken into custody, and soon learned that she would be sent to a drug rehabilitation center where she would be detained until her addiction was beaten. According to later reports, she got down on her knees and begged the police who had her in custody to notify her family about what was happening in order that they should go look after her daughter. And the police did make a couple of phone calls, but did not get through to her family. And this was not just a matter of courtesy on the part of the police, but it's actually a legal requirement in China that when you detain someone, you are required to alert their family. And the upshot was that better than a week later, I think it was about 11 days, Li Guifan's neighbors complained of the odor from the flat, and the 3-year-old was found inside, scratch marks on the door, starved to death. And without knowing the background of the story, a local paper, I think it was the Chengdu Shangbao, published a report asking for anyone with information about this little girl to step forward. And it happened then that the reporter, whose name I think is Li Yaling, learned the details of the story, and out of her own deeply outraged sense of motherhood, wrote a report that laid out the details, and was promptly told by her editor, I don't know if it was her editor's decision or some higher level decision, that this report could not be published, that the paper could not say such bad things about the police, even if they were true. But Li Yaling, who was later celebrated on the Chinese internet as a spokesman spokesperson for youth and virtue, would have none of that and posted the report to the internet, where it was repeatedly censored and reposted by other internet users. And this started a sensation on the internet of people commenting on this story, which eventually spread back to the print media in China. And in a wonderful outcome, two of the police who should have seen that her family was notified were in fact found guilty of dereliction of duty and given prison sentences, I think, of 2 and 3 years. The only catch in this story was that our intrepid reporter was also found guilty of violating proper discipline for reporters, and while she didn't go to jail, she was fired from her position as reporter, and at last report was no longer reporting. The other story that I would like to tell you is a more recent one. This story broke in August, and it concerns a county party secretary in a county that's Lianjiang County. It's a suburb of Fuzhou, and this fellow's name was Huang Jingao. And in August of this year, a letter that he wrote was published in People's Daily, and perhaps more importantly, reprinted in a website operated by People's Daily. And he basically said that owing to his anti-corruption work, he had to wear a bulletproof vest for the last 6 years. 3 years on a case that involved some illegal pig slaughterhouse stuff, and 3 years on a case that involved property development in near Fuzhou. And the gist of his story was that the local power holders were in league with the mafia, and on the one hand, the local mafia was threatening his life for working on this corruption case, and on the other hand, the local leaders were doing everything possible to frustrate his attempts to bring these mafia to justice. It could be that the difference between the local power holders and the local mafia was not that great. About a week after People's Daily published this letter, the Fuzhou Party Committee published their response. His letter was pulled from the internet. Websites all across China were issued instructions that they were to censor any further commentary on this, and the media was not to interview Huang Jingao anymore. But for 1 week, he was a massive national celebrity. He was interviewed on CCTV and reported in all of, well, not all, but many of China's major newspapers. And there were literally hundreds of thousands of supportive posts on Chinese internet sites talking about what a wonderful fellow he was. It could be that we haven't heard the end of the Huang Jingao story yet. Well, there's two pretty good stories. One of the really critical things about these stories is that they are, in fact, really good stories. And if you want justice in China now, it's a really good idea to have a really good story that newspapers could make money selling. Which brings me to the second part of my talk today, which is, what is it in China that makes it possible for stories to escape censorship like this? How can we have these sensations, even if they don't last very long? And there are basically, I think, two things that make these stories possible. The first one is, already discussed by Professor Ogden, is the commercialization of China's media. If we were to go back in time even 20 years, and in many cases even 10 or 15 years, media in China were not run for profit, but were run for expressly political purposes, basically to put the party's point of view across. But there's been a gradual process of commercialization. This actually got started slowly but surely in the early 1980s or even late 1970s with the reintroduction of advertising. And now China's major media are in fact advertising or driven by advertising revenues. There's a fantastic amount of money in Chinese advertising markets. And the profits from that money, or from those markets, flow through China's media and often right to places like propaganda departments that own the media. And so there are some very complex and conflicted interests between what you have to publish to make money and what you have to publish to be appropriately political. With Chinese media caught in a kind of a tug of war in the middle between that. There's been a gradual transformation of the internal organization of media like newspapers or television stations. To where now, well, since actually maybe the middle 1990s, the model is something like administrative organizations with enterprise management. And that means that there are various schemes for profit retention, a lot more freedom to hire and fire staff, and a lot of business decisions can be made by the media organizations rather than by party superiors. In the most recent reform, media have been organized into large groups or maybe blocks, Jituan. And these blocks are intended to be something like Chinese versions of Time Warner that are going to bring a lot of different media together, and they're supposed to compete with each other. Perhaps in classic PRC fashion, this is both a means of fostering competition and a means of limiting competition. By, for example, creating a situation where internet cafes should preferably be franchises run by groups, maybe you get better control over who owns internet cafes and what happens in those internet cafes. Well, let me give you an example of, just a brief example of what media competition is like in China now. There are something like 5 or 6 major dailies in Beijing now. Would that there were an American city with 5 or 6 competitive daily newspapers. Maybe the most interesting of those newspapers is the Xinjiangbao, or the Beijing News. And what's interesting about it is that it's actually a joint venture, which is partly run by the Guangming Bao Jituan. Guangming Bao is another daily that's kind of a little long in the tooth and not very exciting. It was a good thing for them to get some investment from their partners, which is the Southern Daily Group, which is famous for publishing Southern Weekend and the Southern Metropolitan News, which are 2 of China's hottest, most scandal-prone newspapers. And the idea of these Cantonese coming up to Beijing and running a newspaper along Southern group lines is actually very exciting. Never mind that the star editor of the Southern Metropolitan News was charged with embezzlement, perhaps fraudulently. He beat that rap, but did get kicked out of his newspaper and kicked out of the party as well. His slogan for Southern Metropolitan Daily was, in one book that recounted the history of the paper, was, admit that there are truths that cannot be spoken, but do not tell lies. For Chinese media, that's a huge step forward. The second thing that I would like to point to as a source of openness in Chinese media is the rise of China's internet. Now, here we have to be just very careful. There were a raft of reports when the internet first got to China that basically said horizontal internet technology means utopian agora democracy. The Communist Party is doomed. They're going to put up a great firewall, but it's not going to work. And isn't the internet great? Well, that dot-com bubble popped. There's been a much better second-generation wave of internet research about China that points out that actually the party is capable of co-opting the internet and that there are a lot of ways to censor the internet. And I'm not going to go into much detail about what those are today, but trust me, there really is a tremendous amount of censorship on the Chinese internet. And yet, the internet is by far and away the most open space in Chinese media, and a lot of things can be talked about on China's internet, or on the internet in China, that can't be talked about elsewhere. To wit, the example I gave earlier of the reporter who posted her censored report to the internet and got the Li Si sensation started. And there are many other examples of censored materials getting posted to the internet and then getting distribution. There is a case that some of you may well have heard of. Oh gosh. Well, if you haven't heard about it, you're not going to hear about it from me. The last thing I'm going to say about the internet in a kind of a cut and run policy here is that the openness in the internet actually spreads outward to other media. And that because people can read things on the internet, and reporters and editors are heavy internet users, it legitimates printing them in other sources. And there's a new channels through which information can cross. Now, last thing I want to say. First of all, estimates for the number of Chinese journalists in jail vary. I have seen estimates as low as about 24, up to the mid-40s. I think it's reliable to say that China has more journalists in jail than any other country in the world. Estimates for numbers of internet activists in jail are significantly higher than estimates for number of journalists in jail. I think that some of the international NGOs can count upwards of 60 internet activists in jail right now. Now, the very odd thing is that this, too, might be a sign of progress. And the reason I say that having people in jail is a sign of progress is that it points to a breakdown in the traditional means of regulating media in China. I think that the traditional means of regulating media in China can be well characterized as a velvet prison. It was a kind of a deal where journalists got privileges, they got to know things, they got a reasonable standard of living, in return for which they were to exercise a kind of self-discipline. And because of the commercialization of Chinese media, because of the breakdown of the whole vanguard part ideology and a lot of other things, that's just breaking down. There are very few journalists now, well, that's the wrong way. There are a lot of journalists now who just won't play that game and who really do things like post censored reports to the internet. Now, the new style of media regulation, I'm going to call it Praetorian regulation. And it is regulation that is arbitrary and coercive, and further is seen to be arbitrary and coercive. One of the things that we learned from reading the internet postings by ordinary Chinese internet users about the Huang Jingao case was they saw it coming. And there were lots of posts ahead of time that basically said, corrupt, selfish people are going to censor Huang Jingao. They're going to shut him up, and that's just the way it's going to go. Now, what should we make of all this? Well, I think I'm with Professor Ogden on this. There's no guarantee that the breakdown of the Velvet Prison leads to some kind of accountable public sphere and improved party governance. Instead, what it has led to so far is a case or a situation where rules count for less and where coercion is more apparent. But on the other hand, let's go back to the Li Si case and remember that 2 policemen did go to jail. And in a lot of other of these sensation stories, the Chinese authorities have also felt compelled to make concessions. So it could be that this is going to lead in a positive direction.
Thank you. Ms. Guan, last speaker.
Thank you very much. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. And being furthest away from you, I get a few more seconds for the note to reach me, right? So I'll take advantage. But I only speak 10 minutes. It seems to me we are today asking 3 questions. One is, what outcomes do we see in relation to political reform and political regimes coming out of the turmoil in China today? And in the case of a scenario of democratization, how would we get there? And in the third case, we've talked a little less, and I'd like to say something about what we should do about that, what we should do given our conclusions about how it might be possible to get to democratization. That's certainly what I do full time, so it's understandable you'll hear that from me. I think in the case of what outcomes, there's consensus, nobody knows. How would we get there? I do think we should make a few distinctions. If we are taking, let's assume that we are trying to explore the possibility of democratization, I don't think it's an either-or of whether we get gradual reform from below, whether we get a violent and turmoil-filled period of sudden change from below, or a top-down decision to democratize. Actually, probably all 3 of those scenarios come together or go in sequence. And if you look at real-life examples in the rest of East Asia, you see them all coming together. There is bottom-up pressure of all kinds being repressed, having minor successes, not ending in democracy, but being there all along the way. And in that sense, and then some concessions from above, gradual reform. So change is slow, but then, positing again, remember we're positing that democratization of some kind is the outcome, there has to be some kind of decisive break. We wouldn't call it democratization if we didn't get the demise of the Communist Party or the end of the Communist Party rule. So the issue of whether the Communist Party retains power in the process of democratization, in a way, is just a point of definition. If it's still there, it's not democratization. But there has to be some kind of decisive break with the past, but it could build on a long-term process of gradual change where you have tremendous change, putting in place some gradual reforms before some kind of decisive break. So I do think we get both of those scenarios. And the question of what to do about all this, whether we understand all of this very well or not, or whether we agree whether it's actually very likely to happen, I actually think in a way it doesn't matter. Whatever the question, I still have one answer, which is that you want all the kinds of institutional reform that would be necessary to lay the foundation for a democratic system, both in its institutions its processes and mechanisms of governance, and also in the values that have to underlie any kind of stable system. And talked about paving the way for future democratization coming from below in civil society. And clearly, the Deng Revolution has mostly to do with changes coming from the point of view of the state. So if we just look at those two spheres of change, what kind of changes in state institutions are required? And so many of them are happening now in China, and I do believe China is in a better position to set up a fully democratic system because of those changes that have happened already and the ones that probably are coming down the road. All the mechanisms of a market economy, the regulatory institutions of the state for its stock market and for property rights, for contracts, for private business, the question of the vast land of China, how do you decentralize in a pluralistic society, ongoing, needs to go on, the local elections, changing methods of choosing and holding local leadership accountable. And I would mention one other area of governance reform which hasn't been mentioned today, which is other kinds of institutions of governance at the local level that He Baogang likes to call deliberative democracy. That is, mechanisms of accountability, particularly in urban areas, where it's a cadre evaluation meetings. The meeting is held just as we're used to. Of course, in some cities there are experiments with elections for local leaders in cities as well as the countryside. These would be meetings where the residents in a particular district get together and they actually have an evaluation of the performance of the officials at the local level. There are also other deliberative institutions that he would include as being very important to establish and have practice at and improve and have spread and have an impact and influence other institutions of society, including public hearings on public policy changes and mediation and conflict resolution institutions, which need to be put in place as an alternative to the current clearly dysfunctional system. It just does not work for ordinary people to have conflicts with authority figures resolved. The courts are not doing it well. The petition system is terrible, and violence clearly is also not the answer. And clearly, I would lastly list inter-party democratization, the latest question of leadership skill or a new cadre system or whatever kind of ongoing, probably never-ending reforms within the party are clearly part of an institutional reform for state institutions, which again are not bringing us democracy tomorrow, but if they don't happen, it'll be much harder to get to democracy. And then the same thing on the civil society side. And again, you can just remember all the things that have been mentioned today. What kind of unions exist, what kind of media, what kind of virtual society or virtual community can you find on the internet, interest groups and associations. These things, go around in a kind of a spiral fashion, come forward, form, make some progress, have setbacks, and then people learn from each other. And step by step, this is a tremendous change. And these are not, there are none of these institutions in civil society operate as they would in a democracy. They are not creating democracy full-blown. They're not necessarily demanding democratic reform or an end to Communist Party rule. But by going about their business in the way that they do, they're coming around to laying a much firmer foundation for that future. I would say that clearly the media is, I would say, better off than some of the others because of the competition provided by the internet, and not just for the news to get out, but because it has that feedback effect on the official media. And I would say clearly parties will probably be the very last, because as I started out saying, really the sine qua non of defining something as a democracy would be there has to be freedom of association, particularly for parties which exist to contend for political power. And you might have pluralism in all kinds of other institutions, which are working in other spheres, but they're not trying to get political power. And so you can have gradual change. It's not quite democracy, but it is democratization when you have pluralism in other civil society institutions. Parties, that's the real harbinger or the test that tells you you're really at a real democracy. So I do believe that the answer to whatever the question is, my answer always is encourage all these positive developments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we will open the floor for discussion. Please identify yourself and wait for the microphone. Over there, Amy. Over there.
Sure. The one word that no one mentioned is Taiwan. I'm just wondering how relations with Taiwan could affect democratization or the failure to achieve the same in China.
Who want to take this question?
Nobody wants it.
Do you have an opinion?
I'll say a couple of words about that. And I think that Taiwan is the poster child issue for Chinese nationalism at the present moment and serves the function of capturing people's attention and providing a logic for why democratization is neither possible nor desirable, and every bad thing that happens in Taiwan is because of democratization, and it's manipulated in an awful way. Although manipulation is not the only part of that phenomena, there are very many mainland Chinese who are enthusiastic pursuers of this line of thought. And finally, though, let me say that it's not uniform, that there actually are some people in the mainland who have a very sympathetic understanding of Taiwan and who understand that Taiwan's democratization is a model of good things that could happen in the PRC.
You want to add something? Yeah, sure.
If I could just add something, one of the most interesting meetings I ever had in China was at a meeting organized by the Chinese Ministry of Civil Affairs, which is the organization that's also responsible at the national level for sort of overseeing village elections, where they had invited 7 or 8 scholars from Taiwan, where essentially what the scholars from Taiwan were saying is, you guys may not like it, but you're going to have to go the way we go. And there was a time, and this was in the mid-1990s, when people at the Ministry of Civil Affairs quite openly talked about Taiwan as a potential long-term model for China. They don't say that openly anymore, but in private conversations, they still look to Taiwan as, whether it would be whether Taiwan would be a model to copy is one question, but that the fact that a Chinese culture can have democracy is something that people still look to, I think.
No? Yeah, Mr. Gong,
Hi, I'm Gong Xiaoxia from Solidarity Center. I have one comment on the commercialization and the media. I think people see too much positive side, and I monitor the Chinese media every day. One thing I found interesting is that, when reporting the internal affairs in China, you see enormous liberalization, I would say. But in terms of foreign affairs, the commercialization and the party propaganda actually go together. And if you look at, the Chinese media, look at the enormous sensation of nationalism or even xenophobia, it quite fit the commercial model, and especially after September 11th, if you look at the internet and look at the Chinese media, and then even now, you see a lot of anti-Western message, and it sells paper, sells quite well. So I wonder if you have any comments on that.
In fact, I do. And I'm going to blame Gang Lin for his evil notes, cutting me off and preventing me from telling you important points of wisdom, which you have kindly supplemented. Let me say that my model of commercial media would be the Fox News network, which I'm actually not a fan of. And or to pick one of the Fox News networks in a way that all feminists might take offense to, a sister media organization to the Fox News network would be the British tabloid The Sun. And basically, I really have reservations about commercial media. Or to look in another direction, a model of internet freedom might be the Drudge Report. And so I really have very limited expectations for what might result from commercial media. That one of my other stories that I've written about is the Harbin BMW affair, and it would appear that through internet gossip, a significant portion of the Chinese media got that wrong, and actually thought that the rich BMW driver who ended up killing the woman who'd been on the tractor that collided with the BMW, that the reason she got off the hook was because her husband was related to a provincial vice governor. And this later proved to be false. And so Chinese media, even good guys trying to resist power and corruption, get things wrong. Now, having said all that, I actually like mistaken tabloid journalism better than I like the Velvet Prison.
Good. 视频化我呢还说其实很earlier呢，因为呢 next.
My name is Shiping Hua. I'm from the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I have a question for Professor Wigton. First of all, and I know Professor Wigton's works very well. When I was a graduate student, her book was my textbook. When I later on became a professor, I used her book as a textbook as well for my students. So I just have a question, and actually this question comes from your book, Inklings of Democracy. In the book, you said that the idea of Datung is the Chinese word for grand reunion or great unity of harmonies. And basically, you said that even in the 1990s, the majority of the Chinese intellectuals are sort of still guided by this concept, and I think you are right on that. But on the other hand, and last summer I was back in China. I was talking to some of my former friends. One of them, he has traveled all over the world. He said that I have been traveling to so many countries, and I do not know any people in any other country that know how to self-indulge so much, especially when you go to the, corruption, women, money, and basically he said that in the Netherlands, for instance, even the prostitutes, they know how to say some Chinese word like a receipt. Because you have some fun with a prostitute, they give you a receipt. You can get reimbursed. So I was wondering whether you can comment on this disparity. On the other hand, I think you are right in the sense that the Chinese intellectuals, they sincerely still believe in this kind of collectivist vision of the world, which is Datung. But on the other hand, I think in your book, basically you said is that this kind of individualistic tendencies were actually driven by economic activities. So you see this great gap and great disparity between what you believe and what lots of people do. So, thank you.
Thank you, Shiping. I learned one thing from watching the presidential debates between Bush and Kerry, which is that if you don't know the answer to a question, you just talk about what you want to talk about. I'm not sure I can really answer that question. That's a very sophisticated question, but I was, as you know, I was just talking to Shirping before we began today, talking about, recently I was at a conference, people who work on water management of the Yellow River. The Yellow River Commission, by the way, if you can imagine, a river commission in China has over 30,000 employees, all to make such an incredible mess of one river. So you wonder what they're doing. So I said to him, so what is your organizing principle for this? I mean, how are you approaching the problems of the environmental issues and distribution of water of the Yellow River? And he said, you know, our basic principle is the harmony of man and nature, the unification of man with nature. And of course, since they obviously, just as you said, they don't practice this. This is just said, and yet it's something that an American would never say. Well, you can't imagine an American saying, so what's the unifying principle for the management of the Mississippi River? Oh, it's the unity of man and the environment. You know, I mean, it would never occur to us. But and it is true that Chinese are not acting that way. But they seem to think that way, that this is important and that this is the value, this is a goal. It's like, you know, who do we want to govern us? We want people of virtue. You know, that's what they talk about. And we don't think about people governing us who have virtue. It never occurs to us to use the word virtue. I mean, has anybody talked about Bush or Kerry being virtuous? But it is a behavior.
There are people who vote for Bush because he's a Christian.
Yeah, but not because he's good, not evil. You know, he's a good man, and he works hard. But you know, I just think that Chinese do think in these categories, even if they don't act in those categories. And that's really the best answer I can give you. I think that one thing I've felt over many years of studying China is that whenever Chinese are talking about something like filial piety or being civilized, you know they've got a real problem with it. And I think the reason they talk about unity and the Da Tung so much is because they have a serious problem with it.
Okay.
With it not being that way.
1, 2, 3, the third row, the lady first. The third, 1, 2, 3, third.
My name is Corinna Barbara Francis. I wanted to push, I don't need to, push you a little bit more to, and this is open to any of the panelists, but perhaps Professor Thurston and McCormick, to tell us one or two features of, we're all in agreement that there's change and it's moving in some form of democracy or some rather very, you know, broad concept of more openness and competition. One or two features of exactly pushing a little on the idea of political culture, and what ways is political culture going to shape this future system that it's an evolution, but is there one or two features that you can really pinpoint that you do think are real in terms of Chinese political culture that will give some very specific institutional features to some future system? And perhaps the deliberative tendencies, or the avoidance of open confrontation, what is it that you truly believe in, having met all these people and talked to these people, will shape? In my discussions in meeting people, one of the questions that always frustrated me is to know or to get a feeling for, you know, to what extent a willingness to compromise, the willingness to go along with a government position is driven by political culture versus just the power of the government. And Chinese seem very aware of their choices. You know, I can compromise and be more moderate and work with the government And I will get more done if I'm an NGO or if I'm a dissident or if I want to get something. On the other hand, I will compromise often what I want to accomplish. And they often do say that they will work with the government or they'll be more moderate. And in, perhaps Professor Thurston, in meeting some of these NGOs, is there a feeling to which that's driven by what's your gut feeling as to, the role of political culture in that? And perhaps also on the internet question, I felt being there that in some ways the internet, the anonymity, and obviously it's not fully anonymous, there are people who go to jail for it, but for the large majority of the participants, there's an anonymity. They can be, they can disagree with people, but anonymously. They don't have to face someone and, on campus and go to their professors and disagree, So it almost fits nicely with Chinese political culture in the sense that it allows people to be, contentious, but not face-to-face. And it sort of fits nicely with their tendency to want to avoid that in face-to-face, encounters.
You want to answer the question first?
If I could start, and that's a very interesting and I think difficult question. And as you were talking, well, first of all, I have to say that I guess I really don't think that the Chinese political culture is fundamentally democratic. I mean, I think that in order for China really to have a successful democracy, that there are certain fundamental features that have to change. And as you were talking, I was thinking of two examples of that. One of them, I write about, there are things that you write about in the story that you didn't tell that is sort of sticks and you wish you'd told the story, but you didn't know where to put it. That once being at a village election, which was being held outside in a schoolyard, and it was in a sort of remote area, and people around the area had never seen a foreigner, so the knowledge that a foreigner was coming to observe the election sort of spread out to other villages, and so people from lots of different villages came to gather around and watch the foreigners watching the village election. And there was an effort at the beginning to sort of keep them away, to keep them sort of outside the schoolyard where the elections were taking place. And then as time went on and the elections were going on, people were getting closer and closer and closer. And there was I think probably a county level cadre there. And when he saw this happening, he simply turned around and he went to tell them to move back. And they all moved back. And, the fact that two little flicks of the wrist could still have such power sort of made me sort of try. I can't come to grips with it. Here we are having this democratic election, but two flips of the county levels cadre's hand can cause people to obey in a way that never could here, I think. Then the second example, and it has something to. I was thinking as Suzanne was talking that it seems to me that there's a difference between support and legitimacy. I don't know that people sort of are saying I support the government, but I think that the Chinese government is always surprisingly more legitimate than I would think. And my best example of that was in 1989. I was in China for the whole build-up and then stayed in China for a year after the army came into Beijing. And in the fall of 1989, apparently the local farmers in Beijing had overproduced cabbages. At that time, the only vegetable you got in Beijing in the wintertime was cabbage. And so there was a patriotic cabbage movement in China, in Beijing. It was patriotic to buy cabbages. You were supposed to buy more cabbages than you needed so that the farmers would get their money. And I swear to God, the most disaffected people who swore they had no allegiance to the government all went out and bought truckload or cartloads of cabbage. But again, I wouldn't eat cabbage. But this again, a sense of a legitimacy that is surprising to me. So, but having said all that, my own experience is also that when given the opportunity, when given the structures, to behave in democratic ways, the Chinese do it very, very well. When villagers are given the chance to vote and really to choose their own candidates. They vote exactly the way democratic theory says they should vote. They vote in their own self-interest. And similarly with these NGOs, when given, I mean, like this participatory rural assessment, once that's introduced to people, my gosh, they get it immediately, and they run with it. They know how to behave. So it's there, but it has to be nurtured.
I was, this weekend, I was at New York University, where I was being persuaded that my tuition dollars are well spent. This is, and one of very artful speakers told a story about Sam Goldwyn, who's the G in MGM Studios, who is reputed once to have said something pretty close to, I don't want to be surrounded by yes men. I want my staff to give me the bad news, even if it costs them their jobs. And of course, being a China scholar, I heard that and thought that that was a quintessentially Chinese attitude. And well, I mean, we could indulge in some anti-Semitism or something here, but I think that Goldwyn is one of the fonts of American culture. Now, what I mean by this story is that I think that rather than understanding culture as fixed values that constrain our action, that it might be more useful to think about culture as a stock of stories that we tell ourselves, and allow for the possibility that these stories can be differently interpreted by different people. So when I pay attention to the Huang Jinggao story, at the end of the story, they're both talking about the same events, and they're both using, even when I say both, I mean him and the Fuzhou City Committee. They're both using language that sounds like Chinese communist socialist language. And Huang Jinggao is making an appeal to the people who fervently love the Communist Party and wants them to support him in his quest to revitalize and purify the party. And he understands that some people think he's broken rules, but this is what's necessary, and he basically makes a plea for openness in the name of the people. The Fuzhou City Party Committee says that his breach of party discipline has had very negative consequences. It's helped those awful splitists across the straits in Taiwan, and Fuzhou is in such a strategic location. It's given ammunition to these terrible democratic powers that are out to get us. The overseas Democrats are going to go to town on this, and he's even helping Falun Gong people. And to be sure that the story was well covered in the Epoch Times. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that there are people in China who can construct lots of different stories in lots of different ways. What I take as really positive in Chinese culture at the moment is the number of people who go online and of their own accord interpret these stories, these breakaway stories, in ways that I understand as fundamentally demanding rule of law and openness and accountability. And I see that as a really positive sign.
Let me pick up a couple of questions. First, the back over there, then second here.
I want to say that I do agree that there is a process of democratization occurring. I was able to present a paper to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences this summer on the role of political parties in legislative elections. It was clear that what was wanted there was not so much the information, but the trappings that could be grafted on to their democratization, that they could say to the people, we are democratizing. It was quite clear because whenever we'd have just the academics in the room, they would ask legitimately good questions. Whenever we got into a long discussion of that, somebody would trot in, the director, sit down, and immediately the conversation would cease. They were very pleased to talk about the role of their 8 political parties, not just the Communist Party, but the 8 political parties. So I think my question is that clearly from the top down, democratization is not something that they want, and they're trying to figure out how much they can say to the people to make them feel they're getting it. But from the grassroots up, from the village elections up, what role do you see any political parties growing? Certainly NGOs generally do not evolve into political parties. But do we see any hope at the grassroots that the political parties are truly going to be a process of democratization?
Good. Second question, and the last question is here. Then we'll give each panelist 2 minutes.
This question is directed towards Professor Thurston. You touched upon civil societies, and it just seems like a lot of the civil societies that you talked about are co-opted by the state, and they seem to be more of an extension of the state than anything else. It seems like the Chinese are much more pragmatic in terms of using NGOs and whatnot in furthering their gains. It doesn't seem like there's any successful anti-government civil societies being developed, or if there are, they're quickly crushed. And so would you consider such a development of civil society as signs of progress toward democracy, or is it just simply another sign of Chinese pragmatism?
Okay, I would like to each speaker to respond to the question about 2 minutes, so that we conclude the meeting, starting from the Professor Ogden.
Oh, okay. Well, these aren't easy questions. Is there going to be a demand for a multi-party system from the bottom up? Is what you're saying? What you're asking? Let me just say again that, going back to an argument I've made elsewhere, I'm not sure how important parties are in today's very complicated, complex technological world. If you look at Washington here and what happens in Congress, what is really happening is that although we have 2 parties sitting out front, what they are voting on and how they are making those decisions has much less to do with what political party they're in than the particular interest groups and associations that have lobbies here in Washington who tell them what is in the best interest of their interest group to vote for, and there is a lot of money often involved for support for their campaigns for re-election and so on. I'm perhaps suggesting a little bit of what we might call corruption, but I do think that, for example, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat matters much less when it comes to something like, the highway bill, a medical care bill, child care bill. All of these things require extremely knowledgeable people. The drug bill, you can't have somebody just making these on political grounds. They have to be told what all the issues are. And so I think interest groups and the development of the associations, I'll let Anne speak to that more. I think this is much more important than the development necessarily of political parties. When we have had multiple political parties come out of the democratization process, such as we did in Eastern Europe when those countries, when communism fell, I think even at that time, several of those countries had over 100 political parties, but they were really interest groups representing sectors. I think Romania today still has over 20 political parties, and they can't really be representative of the people. They are representing special interest. Just a thought on that.
With respect to the question on political parties, before I first went out to observe village elections in, I think probably it was 1993, I assumed that the biggest issue at the local level was going to be party versus non-party. That was completely wrong. I mean, the Chinese in the village didn't have a notion of a multi-party system or a two-party system. There were issues sort of between party and non-party. I mean, there were some party people who were running for office and some non-party people running for office. The fact is that the party people had a much better chance of being elected because all politics are local. The party people had great connections, both, not just at the village level, but at the township and county level. They could get things done that people who didn't have those connections couldn't get done. So, I mean, again, the people were voting in their own self-interest, and often their own self-interest involved voting for somebody in the party. And in fact, I think in some ways the best way to get democracy in China would be to set up a situation where the party could win, the Communist Party could win. And that's one of the arguments that the KMT was, that these people from Taiwan were making in this meeting that I mentioned at the Ministry of Civil Affairs, that you have to at least set yourself up so the possibility exists that you could be voted out of office. But look at us, we set ourselves up and we got voted into office. That was before Chen Shui-bian came along. That's changed everything. That's why you don't talk about it anymore. But I think Louisa can answer this, because she really has a sense of that you do need political parties, and I think she could answer that question more thoroughly than I. With respect to the NGOs that I'm seeing, certainly, I mean, like I mentioned Project Hope. I mean, Project Hope is a gongo. It's a government-organized or Communist Youth League organized organization. There is no sense whatsoever that it is offering any alternative, that it is in any way sort of in dispute with the government or the party. Although, again, it is very, very effective in terms of getting its work done. These more local NGOs that I'm talking about very, very clearly conceive themselves as representatives of the disadvantaged to the government. The local government is universally perceived as corrupt, as not caring about the interests of ordinary people, and the leaders, both the leaders of these organizations and the members of these organizations, really do see themselves as representing the interests of people that the government doesn't represent. If they were to move in an anti-government direction, no. I mean, that's when you get arrested. That's when you go to jail. But they still have a very, very strong sense of representation and that the government isn't doing good by the local people. And I think that's very important. And to get back to that whole issue of political culture. I mean, the political culture that is being developed in these local level NGOs that I'm seeing is a political culture where you do deliberate, where you do recognize the validity of other people's points of view, where I mean, it is a sort of development of a democratic political culture, which I think is very important.
I'll say just a couple of words about the problem of working inside the system and possibly being co-opted. And I talked to some people who are officially have kind of declared themselves as Teacher Y, and they're outside the system, and they don't have units, and they post essays on the internet and do freelance work for newspapers and things like that, and some of those folk have a really jaundiced view of people who are still inside the system. They've compromised and they've sold out, and they're not really promoting change, and they should be more brave like me, even if it is kind of scary out here. And then there are people that you can talk to inside the system who say that the people outside the system are going to cause chaos, and they have very unrealistic expectations, and it's much more meaningful to stay inside the system and work for incremental change. I personally am completely agnostic about this, and I think that China is much better off because there are some people outside the system. But on the other hand, there are very good people doing very good things inside the system. And there's also some dangerous crazies outside the system and some corrupt sellouts inside the system.
Louisa? I will say a word about political parties. Of course, when I speak of a definition of democracy, requiring that the Chinese Communist Party no longer rule China, that of course means constitutionally, were it to compete in some meaningful way and win power in some ways, then there's a possibility that could be called democratic. And you can take a Taiwan model and simply have party and non-party, allow competition at the local level, not the national level. There can be ways to introduce political competition without formalizing and legalizing political parties. However, that ultimately can work only in limited ways, either at the local level or perhaps competition between factions inside the party. We have a model in Taiwan where some of the most significant competition is within the leading party, let's say, although it's not constitutionally the ruling party. All those possibilities are clearly there. I think the 8 parties are, as you know, clearly window dressing, and themselves really are much more like little elite-level intellectual groups which weigh in at times of crisis, like in 1989, calling for the meeting of a special Congress and opposing martial law, but that really is a holdover from the political structure set up by the revolutionary leaders who were themselves using the party simply to incorporate elites from before the revolution. I think 55 years on, those probably will not be the vehicle for that kind of intervention. If that kind of intervention does come, it won't be from these groups which are nominally called parties. That's the state of my understanding, although I'd love to see some research into them if somebody's looking at that.
We are going to conclude the seminar. Let me turn to the Bob Hathaway, the director of Asia program.
I guess I have a complaint to register. Going to get me in trouble with my wife because I had planned to step out of here shortly after we started and do some other things that had to be done today, and I found all 4 presentations so interesting that I couldn't leave. So it really was a good program. Gong, if this is the type of program you put together on your birthday, then you should have more birthdays. I just want to express my thanks to all 4 of our speakers for really giving particularly good panel. We do 45 or 50 of these a year, but this one really stands out. So thanks to all of you. Thanks as well to all of you for joining us. I think our next China program or Taiwan program is the 15th of November?
November 17th, Wednesday afternoon from 3:30 to 5:30 about Chinese ideology between utopianism and realism. Utopianism will be presented by our fellow Sipinghua over there. He's laughing.
So join us in about 3 weeks. Thanks for coming. Thanks to our panelists.